This morning we have really a distinct pleasure of really trying to assess back in a bigger sense, an anniversary that has come up in this year 2022. There are all kinds of like anniversaries of people who really are fascinated with what happened this time or that time. But this is the 30th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 and the formulation of the European Union, when the European Economic Community becomes more of a European Union. And 30 years later, looking back and assessing back is also very, very important. And I can't think of a better person to do this than my good friend and colleague, somebody that I respect highly, Dr. Charujas. First of all, I want to say thank you to contributing institutions and partners that have brought this to you, including the Karamanlis Chair at the Fletcher School and Professor Arvanitopoulos, the International Relations Institute of Pantheon University, the American University of Athens, the American College of Athens at Tiri, the National University of Public Administration, International Relations in Romania, and of course my very good friend Vesco Garcevic, who has been our ambassador in residence here and a very good contributor and friend to the program overall. I will turn the microphone over to our intern here at Emmanuel College, student at Emmanuel College and at Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, Matthew Hogan, who will introduce our keynote speaker this morning, and hopefully have a Q&A immediately after that. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dimitri, for doing this.
Thank you, Dr. Vambakis. So today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Petros Vambakis, who is an associate professor of political science at Emmanuel College and is the director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, and Dr. Dimitri Charousuras, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, who is currently an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at Bilkent University in Turkey, as well as being a visiting scholar at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a visiting associate professor at Virginia Tech. He is a member of the Scientific Council of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels and a World Bank consultant, as well as being involved in a multitude of other organizations. In his research, Dr. Charousuras, specializes in European politics as he seeks to transcend disciplinary divides to incorporate insights from IR, comparative politics, and political economy. He's the author of numerous articles on European politics, comparative politics, political economy, and Greek and Turkish relations. Before turning our microphone over to the speaker, I want to let you know that I will act as a host of this event and will guide the Q&A, which will follow 45 minutes presentation. The duration of this program will be an hour and 30 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. Can I also welcome everyone this morning here in the US, afternoon in Greece, and wherever you are sort of tuning in from the rest of the world. Before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers for having me. It's a great pleasure for me, it's an honor to be part of this very distinguished set of panelists who have been addressing the very important issues throughout the week. And my special thanks, of course, go to my good friend, Professor Vambakis, for his kind invitation. What I want to do today, as mentioned by Petros at the beginning, is to try and shed some more light on the European Union's global role, and in particular, in light of the 30th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty, which made the then European Economic Community the European Union that we are familiar with today. And of course, anniversaries are strange things because they obviously invite you to look back at what happened over the period of time in question, in our case, 30 years. But they also throw out interesting questions, some of which I hope we will be able to deal with today, in terms of whether the European Union has been able to live up to its potential. Now, as we make a start on this, and given the fact that we will begin from the 1990s, I want to make a set of remarks which will hopefully outline for you where the European Union was at the time of its creation in terms of it being constituted as a political entity. And then I will also want to address a couple of things which are on the title of my lecture, namely geopolitics and the way in which the European Union has been able or unable to locate itself within a rapidly changing international order. And towards the end of my presentation, I will talk about democracy as well. And hopefully this element of democracy is going to sort of chime in well with the geopolitical remarks about Europe that I will also make. So let me start with the first chunk of my presentation, which is the early 1990s, the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in this beautiful little town in the Netherlands in February of 1992. The European Union is constituted and it is being created precisely at a time when massive change is happening all around the world. To put it in one sentence, the European Union is created during the unipolar moment. The European Union is created at a time when the Cold War has now finished and has thankfully finished peacefully. The Soviet Union has been dissolved, and East European states can now claim their independence from being around the orbit of Moscow and can determine their own fate going forward. Europe is part of this unipolar moment in ways more than one. But I think the most important one of all, given US hegemony at that particular moment in time, is the unrelenting belief that the underlying values which brought Europeans together already in the 1950s have actually won the day. They have won the battle of ideas. And fundamentally, and I think that's important for us to keep in mind going forward, in the early 1990s, Europe believes that it has won the battle of ideas because liberalism and free market capitalism will now be the undisputed territories on which any sort of political battle will be played out. This is the time, remember, in which the triumphalism of the West about the absence of any alternatives to a particular model of political economy as construed by international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, with the United States being the hegemon in the system that has now become unipolar from bipolar, is running very, very deep. This is also the moment in which the now dissolved Soviet Union is facing a series of important challenges. Russia in the early 1990s is lying low, very low. Life expectancy is going down. The country's international prestige has been diminished, and a series of major economic and political problems have emerged. So it is only natural that the European Union is able to claim that it has won the battle of ideas, that it can continue deepening already pre-existing projects that have seen the light of the day, particularly in the 1980s, and at the same time, that it will be able to peacefully incorporate through the process of enlargement the newly emancipated states of Central and Eastern Europe. And if we look at this picture today, 30 years down the road, I think it's only right to claim, because the European Union is getting a lot of stick these days, but some of it is, I think, not warranted. It has been able to be very, very successful. So if you think about the European Union 30 years ago, the major project that the EU envisaged for itself was to continue with the process of deepening economic integration. It had started already in the 1950s and 60s by setting up, removing barriers to trade, moving on to the creation of a single external economic tariff. By the mid-1980s, it had proceeded to a single market, which is pretty much complete today. And the next step at that time was to launch a single currency with all the political paraphernalia in terms of political sovereignty for Europe that this would actually entail. And as I mentioned earlier, the record in that sense is very positive. It did launch a single currency. 19 EU countries are today sharing a common currency. But what is less discussed, of course, is that the single currency was not meant to be the end of that particular project. Because following the single currency, what was envisaged was a genuine economic as well as political union. And this is where the problems for Europe begin, of course, as we move on from the 1980s to the 2000s all the way to today. Europe, in essence, made a decision, pulled on the one hand by the forces of ethnocentrism, which remained important in some member states, and its desire for a supranational, quasi-federal entity on the other. Remember, European Union is a unique experiment. It's a regional organization, unlike any other. It's work in progress all the time. And that battle between the more federalist and the more nation-centered depiction of how the future should look like had clear repercussions on that major project. In other words, full economic integration had to wait. It proved impossible despite the fact that the single currency was launched. In essence, the construction of the European project meant that although a lot of power was centralized in Brussels and among the European Union institutions, at the time when member states lost their national autonomy and capacity to set interest rates, to devalue their currencies because they moved to the euro, at the same time, the European Union did not have enough resources, did not create the sort of collective finances that would have allowed for redistributive politics and the idea of a genuine economic union. And of course, the Eurozone crisis is the best example of how this played out. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because if you have an incomplete economic integration project, it becomes almost impossible to move on with political integration in the way that federalists envisaged it. Because unless you have genuine economic integration within the particular bloc, political integration will have to come another day. Of course, Europeans have been very good at the politics of symbolism. The Maastricht Treaty, after all, is about recognizing our common European Union flag, establishing the EU anthem as the main point of departure for newcomers. And during the 1990s, of course, this process proved also successful in the sense that more countries were peacefully integrated into the Union. Europe became whole and free, with some exceptions that we will mention, and a series of countries joined in. Now, during that time, as we mentioned at the beginning, countries such as Russia and soon China, whose economic growth was advancing throughout, were lying low. They were recognizing that the unipolar moment underpinned by US hegemony was indeed there. But of course, the tectonic plates, if you like, of global geopolitics started changing quickly. And that's where the record for the European Union becomes a lot more ambivalent and I think a lot more negative. Although important milestones and successes have certainly been registered over the last 30 years, it is undeniable that Europe ended up in concurrent crises that it was unable to deal with over time. Sometimes we forget that the Maastricht Treaty, which is of course today largely synonymous with the economic project I outlined before, the forming of the single currency and so on, actually entailed some very important political elements as well. It created the so-called three-pillar structure on how the European Union is meant to work. And the second pillar was something called the CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy. And the idea was precisely as mentioned earlier, that some form of political integration had become necessary. But the idea that is that political leadership needed to be exercised had become very common. And in Europe's own backyard, again in the early 1990s, The civil war in the former Yugoslavia, by the end of the decade, war had broken out in Kosovo as well, meant that surely now that Europe had become more of an economic superpower, it would be in a position to match its economic capacities, particularly in the trade field, with a renewed political role. And again, if you look at a scoreboard of some sort, you could say that important progress has been made in that respect as well. With subsequent treaty change, we now have the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, essentially a foreign minister for Europe, who coordinates policy for member states, and through which, in important policy areas, foreign policy coordination has been achieved. If you consider the stance that the European Union has been able to take on sanctioning Russia, for instance, following the illegal annexation of Crimea, you can see that important steps forward have been made in terms of seeking to coordinate the foreign policy responses of member states. But overall, the record in this very important dimension of policy is actually quite negative. It's been 30 years since the launch of CFSP, and Europe has yet to acquire a common foreign and security policy. And today, we know that this matters more than at any other point over the last 30 years. We are all familiar with the continuing skirmishes in and about the Ukraine. You all know that the United States and the Russian government are in ongoing, rather fuzzy talks about how to resolve the ongoing dispute. What we do know is that the European Union, which has been at the heart of the original crisis in the Ukraine 8 years ago, with the Maidan uprising and so on, is essentially absent from the diplomatic table. And that surely speaks to the inability of Europe to form and launch a policy in which it will define what is considered to be the European interest above and beyond member states' national foreign policy positions, and act on that front in the sort of decisive way that would be expected from a union as strong economically as the European Union is today. Another example of similar failure on the part of CFSP is, of course, Syria, in which, again, in Europe's close neighborhood, in Europe's immediate neighborhood, uprising, civil war, subsequently to be defined by developments through the rise of ISIS, led to a complete absence of Europe in playing any sort of important role. And of course, nature, as you all know, hates a vacuum, right? The vacuum has to be filled. And if the European Union is not going to be that player, even in its immediate neighborhood, who is going to be in a position to articulate a policy that will subsequently be followed up through action, others will. In the case of Syria, it is clear that powers such as Russia and Turkey have been able to, at least to a certain extent, fill that vacuum. And in conjunction with the fact that US foreign policy has been under serious reconsideration over the last 20 years, has meant that the West as a whole, and Europe in particular, has been unable to hold a particular stance and force particular events on the ground in line with its own interests. And that brings me to the second part of today's talk, which is, of course, geopolitics. You see, the European Union was created and built on the idea that geopolitics does not matter any longer. If you go back to the formation of the European Union, the process of European integration, it is all premised on the hyper-liberal assumption that the old nation-state concept, and therefore the geopolitical repercussions that follow from its existence, are no longer important and or necessary for the citizens of the world in order to advance stability and economic prosperity. After all, the whole project of European integration is precisely premised on the idea that the nation state has to be tamed, it has to be controlled, it has to be regulated, and according to the Federalists, probably wouldn't be a bad idea to abolish it altogether. And so in that sense, as the Cold War ended and the unipolar moment emerged, this sort of reading of history, if you like, this sort of reading of world politics appeared to be very important. But we all know how the game played out afterwards. 9/11 is a watershed moment here. 9/11 happens 20 years ago. And of course, it throws into doubt a lot of the assumptions about the end of history during the triumphalist 1990s. But it also brings back the idea that maybe new forms of geopolitical movement may be on the go, and that powers such as Europe in this case should be in a position to play a role in them. After the launch of the common foreign and security policy, Europe did try to formulate a new security strategy. 9/11 became one of the launch pads for this new security strategy, then underpinned by Javier Solana, the then CFSP High Representative of Europe, who was also, of course, the former NATO Secretary General. Little movement happened on the ground. And I think that one of the underlying reasons behind this was, on the one hand, the US security guarantee, the assumption that is that the United States, in partnering with European nations under the NATO umbrella and beyond, are going to be able and take over most of the responsibility when it comes to dealing with new threats of terrorism and cybersecurity wherever they emerge in the world. And on the other, of course, deep political disagreements among member states themselves, who fundamentally continued to believe, despite the changing reality on the ground, that their experiment, their way, their model, a post-national integration process, a quasi-confederation based on allegiances that are shared between the nation and the bigger supranational entity, that this model was still the model to follow, that the idea of national interests competing on the ground, allowing for the return of geopolitics, was a thing of the past. I think the last decade has taught everyone, including European Union officials and policymakers, that this assumption has proven to be wrong, and that the return of geopolitics that we have been witnessing over time means that Europe needs to take care of that particular policy area in a way that it has not been able to do until now. That allows me to also mention another important point, which has to do, of course, with the disagreements between the United States and Europe on how exactly this will look like. Many have emphasized, rightly or wrongly, the previous US administration, the Trump administration's insistence on Europeans sharing more of the burden, particularly the financial burden, within the NATO alliance, raising their expenditures to 2% of GDP, something that only very few countries have been able to achieve within the alliance to date. Now, one important thing to consider about this is, and although we are focusing on the last few decades, the important point here is that ever since 1945, ever since the new global political architecture emerged after the Second World War, the United States and Europe have had disagreements about how the transatlantic alliance is going to play out. If one goes back to the Vietnam War era, for instance, the split between the US on the one hand and Europe on the other, particularly European public opinion on US foreign policy, is actually quite astonishing. We see the same thing, of course, being repeated in the early 2000s after 9/11, following the decision by the Bush administration to invade Iraq, and the disagreements that emerged at that moment between France and Germany on the one hand and the United States on the other, did not allow for the articulation and coordination of foreign and security policy in a way that would have bound all of Europe's major powers. Please remember that the UK, which was still a member of the EU at the time, was of course allied with the Bush administration's policy on Iraq. France and Germany were on the other side of the fence. And whilst those missed opportunities emerged, Europe was unable to stop the war in Yugoslavia. Europe had to rely on the United States again by the end of the decade in Kosovo. Europe was split and divided over the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. As I mentioned earlier, none of those things are happening, of course, in a vacuum with other powers waiting on the lines. Russia, and then over time China, able to utilize abundant minerals, benefiting from higher prices for energy, were able over time to articulate a new policy dogma in which their staunch national interest defense would go through an attempt to try and rebuild some of the alliances of old, and particularly in the case of Russia, the development of a new foreign policy dogma or old foreign policy dogma, depending on your perspective, according to which the immediate neighborhood of the Russian Federation, the old Soviet Union with some extensions, remained part of the vital national interest of the Russian Federation. And this is precisely the reason why, when it came to the Ukraine, when it came to Georgia in 2008, open conflict became inevitable, precisely because the entire philosophical starting point of organizations like the European Union, that is to say, the idea that every nation state can determine its own fate based on its own understanding of where it belongs, clashed strongly, almost inevitably, with that of Russia. In the meantime, when it came to the economic realm, in which Europe was able to register many more successes, problems started to emerge too. I'm not going to go into the details of the Eurozone crisis, but that was big. And what is also missed sometimes is that this wasn't only a period of profound crisis for the institutions of the European Union, it also had important geopolitical consequences. Member states, such as like my own native Greece, found themselves not only in economic doldrums, but frequently also isolated in terms of their ability to rebuild their economy in a way that would have been in line with the political and economic priorities they had set in previous decades. When it came to the privatization of certain utilities or certain services and industries, often it was the emerging powers, and in particular China, that were able to fill the vacuum where the United States or other West European member states were absent. So the port of Piraeus, for instance, was handed over to the Chinese COSCO company precisely because there were no alternatives out there. Now, the argument here is those are not innocuous economic transactions. They do display the willingness on the part of powers such as China or indeed Russia to use economic penetration as a diplomacy tool. In the case of China, this has become quite evident through the articulation of a policy strategy that desires to deal with EU member states on a bilateral basis. You may want to call it, particularly if you're skeptical towards a strategy, the divide and rule strategy. Now, we all know that the European Union is only as powerful as the collective accumulated sum of its member states allow it to be. That is to say, if one is in solidarity with the other, then altogether that collective entity can become quite powerful, at least in the economic sense. If a divide and rule strategy is allowed to go through, and if China is allowed to deal with member states on an individual basis, it becomes a lot more difficult to see how European Union member states, and therefore how the EU itself, will be able to maintain a strong role and not undermine its own position vis-a-vis rising Chinese antagonism. Finally, I want to make a few remarks with regard to democracy. We said from the very beginning of this talk today that Europe believed in the 1990s that it won the game. And one of the ways through which it articulated liberal democracy and free trade capitalism as the only game in town was through the conditionality policy that it implemented vis-a-vis newcomers from the East. And so countries like Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and the rest were seen as model countries whose economic transition had been smoothened out through the process of EU accession, and who, of course, enriched the European Union through their presence, not least by becoming consolidated liberal democracies. Now we know that there are certain challenges here, ultimately linked to the crisis of global democratic governance and the rise of global authoritarianism, phenomena that we see outside of Europe. Pronounced cases are, of course, Russia, Turkey, India, and even in countries such as Brazil, such phenomena have started to rise. The problem for Europe is particularly strong because authoritarian tendencies by what was considered to be consolidated democracies have started to arise in recent years at an increased pace. The sample countries, if you like, in that respect are Poland and especially Hungary, but they are not the only ones. The same phenomenon of what the literature calls democratic backsliding is actually occurring in some Western European states as well. And that phenomenon too calls into question some of the very fundamental beliefs of the European Union about the way it works, about the sort of values it projects to the rest of the world, and about its own comparative advantage in a world which is now divided, in a world in which, following the unipolar moment, we have ended up with a strange type of multipolarity, with different layers of institutions on top of each other, and very clear guidance as to how governance can move forward. This is not the kind of template the European Union wants. The European Union can only prosper, and it can only prove to be a stable economic and hopefully political power if the rules of the game are clear, if non-discrimination principles in economic and political terms are actually applied, and where everyone shares a liberal democratic template of fundamental human rights respect, respect for minorities, etc., etc. Europe is therefore now faced with a twin challenge on the democratic front. Not only does it have to continue suffer from accusations, particularly from Eurosceptics, about its own non-democratic functioning in terms of the so-called democratic deficit and the inability of the EU institutions to represent their people. That is a long-running story, the validity of which I think is actually quite limited, but more importantly, it suffers from another democratic problem, namely the fact that its own member states, some of those member states that have professed a belief in the fundamental EU values surrounding human rights, the rule of law, and liberal democratic principle, the independence of the judiciary, free media, the free civil society, and so on, those member states themselves now appear to have lost faith in that particular template. And therefore, to bring all of this together, the European Union faces today a situation which is indeed unprecedented. 30 years after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, there is no doubt that it has important achievements under its record. The single currency has indeed happened. Europe has been able to move forward and establish more of a political sense in terms of its own destiny. The COVID-19 pandemic's response by Europe appears to suggest that more steps towards political integration are indeed in the offering. But this would be to only look at the bright side. And of course, we're here to address the very important, and I would argue, structural challenges that Europe faces at the same time, both with regard to its own geopolitical role in a world which is changing rapidly. Europe has been unable to respond, and it remains a big question mark as to whether it will be able to continue shielding its member states from influences from the outside, and at the same time play a role in itself in terms of addressing some of those. And finally, when it comes to democracy, the undermining of liberal democratic values from within is, as manifested in the case of Brexit, for example, a sure recipe for the continuation of centrifugal forces that may actually lead to European disintegration. We're certainly not there, but all of the warning signs, all of the lamps, if you like, are already shining through, and Europe needs to react to that. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Quite a very thorough presentation indeed. I personally didn't expect anything less, and I'm sure our audience fully agrees at the comprehensive and very insightful and very informative presentation, taking us through the last 30 years and really giving us the overall scope of things. And I invite people to, this is the time to really interact with our speaker, and I am going to take the opportunity and as a true academic and really give it the microphone and not give it up that easily. But I will ask a question, to Dimitri. I agree with most of the points that you make as far as the assessment that you put out there, and say that almost like it seems like the European experience of the last 30 years has been like a two-faced experience. Like the first part, I would say, all the way up to the breakdown of or the breakout of the financial crisis in 2008. It seemed like we were in the good phase, and then 2008 to today, it seems like we're in the troubled phase, that where the European architecture does not necessarily seem to be able to be agile enough to address the needs. And I think you did a very nice job presenting that. To the point of the geopolitics, which you also referred to before, we talked even about democracy, but to the point of the geopolitics and what's going on in this part of the world that we have been looking at the last few days, how much of a rift do you see in major players like a France or a Germany having their own kind of a game, really emerging clearly with the UK and Brexit? I mean, they have really said, okay, we're going to, our reflexes are there, like our old geopolitical reflexes of, going back to the 19th century are there. But how much of that is also evident in the France, Germany? So it's almost like you have like this various heads of emerging in the geopolitical aspect.
Thank you, Petros. First of all, thank you so much for your kind words in terms of the presentation itself. But I think the question you're asking is very pertinent, because it's a very clear example, isn't it, of a fundamental misalignment, if you like, of priorities in the Eastern Mediterranean. France, over the last decade, has made it very clear, I think especially under the Macron presidency, that it is willing, and it's also capable in terms of investment, financing, and military operations, to play a role, as you mentioned, reminiscent of what it used to do in the wider Middle East, in the way that it has been reshaped in the early 21st century. The alliance, which is assuming a strategic character with Greece, is a clear example. But if you go beyond this, and if you look at the role of France in Libya, if you look at the role of France in the Lebanon in particular, you at least come to appreciate the extent to which the Elysee appears to have a particular concept of where it wants to go. Now, for Europe, that is quite a positive coincidence, in the sense that Macron is clearly the most pro-Europeanist French president in recent living memory, and is very willing to tie up Paris's conception of the role of France in the Eastern Mediterranean, a more activist, interventionist role, in support of international law, in support of fundamental political principles that underpin the West, with the European Union's own ambition to build up what I mentioned in the lecture, right? A common security policy, a common foreign policy. However, and that goes to what you said, we don't get the same signals from Berlin. And since you mentioned the Eurozone crisis, Germany was mentioned and criticized during the Eurozone crisis for having a more domestically oriented approach. I think the same has been played out over decades, and is evident today too, when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean and the way that its politics is shifting. Germany is unwilling or unable or reluctant, you can use whichever adjective you want, to actually become more of a protagonist and align forces with France. Now, we know from European integration that when the French and the Germans don't work in sync, not much moves. It just doesn't. And in this case, it's clear that the reluctance on the part of Germany to become more of a protagonist is holding Europe back.
More of a protagonist in a European sense, because they certainly want to be a protagonist in a very German sense, right? So the question of this German Europe or European Germany is certainly on the table, and very the uncertainty of this change of government in Berlin also makes it even more difficult. And I think that what I want to take, because you did mention Macron, so what does that do with the looming election in France, as far as even the democracy aspect and the geopolitics? I mean, it's almost like coming up in April of this year, we might see that crossover, both of those segments that you address, democracy and geopolitics, coming together in the French election.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think on the part of Germany, we need to be quite careful here. What I mean is, Germany doesn't, in my understanding, Germany sees the project of European integration as a multi-level, multi-layered project. Okay, so when it comes to the European Union being a protagonist in itself, with Germany at its heart and Germany leading the pack, excuse me, they have no problem whatsoever this happening when it comes to the economic playing field. So the new German coalition government, for instance, and I've been doing some research on this lately, appears to me a lot more willing to negotiate with European partners and potentially take the lead in revising the rules of the game with regard to Maastricht, fiscal orthodoxy and so on. We are in a new world in that respect, and the Germans don't mind it. I think they can be the leaders in this. But when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to an understanding of Europe articulating a new foreign policy dynamic, the intergovernmentalist tendency in Berlin is very strong. And the memories of old, the idea that every nation should make sure that it takes care of its core interests. We know, for instance, how strong relations between Germany and Turkey have been and continue to be. That policy dogma is not going to change. Now, is that a challenge for Macron in April? I don't think so. I think that cooperation between the two is very good and very smooth. I can also predict that Macron will get re-elected. It seems that the pack is stacked in its favor at the moment, but this will do little for Europe as a force to move forward in that respect.
Thank you. I see both Vesco and Mr. Danis have come on board. So that's my cue that they really want to come in and participate in this discussion. I also see a Q&A question. So I'll let Matt go to the Q&A, and then maybe Vesco and Mr. Danis can have their way at it. So Matt, the floor is yours. Why don't you address that question?
Yes, thank you for the great presentation, and it was great hearing about it today. So a question from the chat: if the EU continues lacking a coherent and common foreign policy strategy on key issues such as Russia, Turkey, and the Mediterranean, will it be able to survive an influential geopolitical entity? Do you think it will be realistic to expect a EU coherent foreign policy strategy?
Right. Thank you, Matt, and thanks a lot for the question. My argument is that the European Union at this moment in time is not in a position to be a geopolitical player. So in terms of losing more ground when it comes to whether it can articulate a particular foreign policy role, I don't think there is much to lose, to be very blunt. If you have a decade-long civil war, conflict, whatever you want to call it, next door, I'm referring to Syria, and you don't even have a minimal diplomatic presence on the ground, outsourcing that role to countries like Turkey and Russia, there is very little to expect going forward. Now, where it becomes dangerous, and I want to address the question directly, is when you have countries outside the bloc, in this case Turkey, openly define member states, openly define the rights of member states as articulated by international legal agreements, and the European Union doing nothing. Now, there, the question becomes one of power politics. So are countries like Cyprus or Greece in a position to find alternative sets of patrons? Are they in a position, and do they favor isolating the European Union in favor of other alliances? My answer to that would be no. And so in that respect, although the European Union cannot act, and it cannot act on the ground, but in a way that makes clear what its own position is, there is also precious little to lose if you remain on a minimalist definition of ticking the right boxes, for instance, applying certain sanctions to certain individuals in Turkey, as it has done to this day, but then continuing continuing as normal. And therefore, and that's my last sentence on this, I don't think the European Union will disintegrate because of its inability to formulate, a common foreign and security policy. We are very far from it. Overall, I think the European Union is a very successful experiment in a new form of governance, there's no doubt. But when it comes to its geopolitical role, it has been minimal, and all chances are it will remain minimal.
Thank you so much. I actually had a question personally as well. So you talked about the democratic attitudes within Europe. How has that been affected by the recent pandemic, especially on the state versus federal level, where we see more states acting within their own interests and not as the union or in the best interest of the European Union?
The pandemic itself, Matt, I think has not actually undermined democratic values as such. What it has done in a number of member states, and I don't think that's only a European phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, is reflect underlying problems with the way that democracy was working up to this point, right? So if you take an example here, the anti-vax movement, which appears to be, let me be careful here, correlated with people who do have certain authoritarian tendencies. Well, although it's not a perfect correlation, those phenomena existed before, right? I think the track record of Europe in terms of the way that it tried to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic is actually quite positive in terms of being able to centralize procurement of life-saving vaccines, eventually getting its act together in terms of distributing aid like medical equipment and supplies to member states and beyond, and of course also playing a very strong humanitarian role by exporting those outside the Union in countries in the Western Balkans and beyond. So altogether, up to this point, and hopefully we're coming to the end of the pandemic, but if we were to come to the end of the pandemic today, I think Europe has not been undermined by the pandemic. It has a lot to do, however, as every other country in the world does, in terms of economic recovery and reimagining social cohesion in the new context.
Awesome, thank you so much. So now Ambassador Garcevich and Mr. Danis, I believe have some questions as well.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I have to say that it's a very thought-provoking, and I agree with almost all points made during the presentation. From just before proposing question, a comment from the microcosmos perspective, Western Balkans perspective, and Macron and Germany, as France and Germany. As you know, I'm sure that you know this. I think that France policy towards the Balkans is not popular among Europeans in the Balkans, as France is perceived as a country which strongly opposes further enlargement. And Macron himself, at the beginning of his presidency, introduced this issue and played hard on it, actually putting the process on hold. Whereas Germany and Berlin is seen as the only big and powerful country within the European Union who is still pushing forward the idea of enlargement. So that the context of power dynamics within two big countries within the European Union looks differently from different corners of Europe. I would say that if you ask somebody from Ukraine, that one is going to tell you something else. But my question is related to your points about how European Union is built. I completely subscribe with your point that it is built on premise that we are living the end of history, that liberal democracy is winning, the time of nationalism and national states is behind us. As you remember so very well, at the time, the European Union member states and their politicians were looking at the situation in Yugoslavia as the remnants of the past, or something which is can be attributed to the 19th century politics, national identity politics, or so on and so forth. Then national identity politics is coming back. So my question is then, maybe from a different perspective, what do you think did the European Union miss the opportunity at that point to build up something which we can describe as European identity? What is European identity? How a Greek and Swede can look at one another as being Europeans? What keeps together a guy from Spain and somebody from, let's say, Latvia? Did you think that that was the right moment to build up because it was the golden era or European idea, or it was simply not possible?
It's $1 million question, isn't it? If I had the answer, I mean, I would probably not be sitting here, to be completely honest with you. It's a great question. Let me try and think this through a little bit. You will recall, Vesco, that in the early 1990s, the idea was the Maastricht Treaty is going to mention a federal Europe, right? And because Britain was part of it and John Major had his own domestic problems, the formulation they decided to go down with was ever closer union of the peoples of Europe instead of a federal Europe. So my point is, with regard to the identity that you mentioned, some people were looking at that period as an opportunity structure, no doubt. However, let me try and be a bit more cautious and a bit more conservative with a small c here. Ever since the Maastricht Treaty allocated more powers to the EU, we all know that the European Union became more of a, not only a political entity, but also a politicized entity. It entered domestic politics, right, in every single member state that it is present. It has become part of the domestic rules of the game, if you like, and it's being hotly contested between supporters and those who reject it. If an attempt was made to create a centralized, if you like, super identity based on the legalism and formalism and the sort of institutional rules of the game that only Brussels people actually understand, I think the backlash would have been even bigger than it has been already. The second part of my answer to your question would be slightly more optimistic from a Euro-friendly point of view, and that is that, well, we already have, do we not, a sense of European identity that penetrates people, as you mentioned, from north to south, when Europeans come in touch with those outside of the continent. And so if you look at Eurobarometer data, for instance, the vast majority of us believe that I am fundamentally Greek, but I also firmly believe that I'm also European, especially when I find myself, let's say, in the Americas. And finally, just to be a bit more provocative here, you're right. What does a Greek and a Swede have in common? In the same way that what exactly does a person from Louisiana have in common with a person from Maine or Vermont, right? So it's basically a process of historical construction where eventually we may end up with something resembling more a centralized identity.
Just a comment. I completely agree with your points. Really, I like how you describe the process. As you mentioned before, the European Union is a concept, is an evolving concept, is a fluid concept, and it is not carved in the stone, which means it is, first of all, a unique experience in terms of building back up a new regional organization, which is not just organization, which has elements of federation or confederation, and therefore identity is constructed as American identity is constructed, as Greek identity is constructed, and all identities of today are new phenomena. But just I think that Europeans should look at American experience. I agree with you that centralized, imposed on identity is something that doesn't work. But European identity can exist and can survive and can be successful only as a multi-layer identity, because we are all, you are Greek, but you are a European. You can be Swede, but you can be European. You can be, if you like, American, Swede, and European. You can be whatever you want, as long as it is open for different identities, which actually countries like Australia or New Zealand or US did, and then Europe will survive. The idea of European identity will survive in my view. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Professor Sarujas, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I look at the European Union as an organization that has really been very positive for the last, since the end of World War II, and have kept a economic community together. And the pandemic right now, I think even before that, during the Brexit, it became sort of a fragile organization. And I almost can categorize the European Union as a foster home, a home that has brought in 27 or whatever number of children into one roof under the German economic roof. And of course, France is always trying to be one of the leaders and trying to insert their own identity as well as leadership, and trying to train taking place in every area of the strategic position of European Union. Europe is in a sort of left from the American foster home umbrella, protecting it from the Soviet Union and Russia. And now Germany depends, or Europe depends on the Russian energy. And we have the pandemic, we have the wars that brought a big migration in the eastern part of the Mediterranean and Turkey in specifics. So between the nationalism and the European Union trying to be a one big power, and Turkey threatens them and use the migration problem, it is difficult to navigate under the present conditions and situation. The United States is now pivoting towards Asia and sort of letting Europe to take over, but Europe is not neither able, trained, or has that kind of a united effort. It is a nationalism effort, and that's why Turkey is able to do what they're doing, including being a member of NATO and buying weapons from an adversary that the NATO countries looking at Russia as to be, especially with the Ukraine situation. How do you bring that together in and bring the European Union into a global power, sharing with the United States, Russia, and China?
Sir, thank you so much for your question. I have to say I agree with a very large part of your analysis, because it does reflect my own thinking about the way in which this asymmetry between Europe being an economic giant and a political mini player underpins the current situation. As I mentioned in my lecture, I think it's going to become impossible for the European Union to become a player with the weight and influence that can look in the eyes towards other major regional or global players, so long as it continues to sing from the old hymn sheet. So what I mean is, as I mentioned in the lecture, the European Union was premised on the idea that its own set of values and assumptions about liberal democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are not only its own source of strength, which is true, but they are also a source of strength for everyone around it. And if everyone else imports those and consolidates them and implements them in their foreign policy and domestic policy practice, everyone will be better off as a result. Remember, the European Union is fundamentally premised on a liberal set of assumptions, both political and economic. So it sees this as a win-win scenario. Now, my point is, Europe was caught, and I think you mentioned it, sir, completely unprepared for a turn of the tables. They did not anticipate the situation in which the interest of the United States in maintaining the security umbrella by stationing troops in Europe will fade away. The pivoting to Asia started 15 years ago, and the Obama administration was very clear about this, first with Russia and then with Asia. They did not anticipate that geopolitics will return because great power politics through the rise of China will emerge. They assumed that China is going to be another major player in the World Trade Organization, with which, again, win-win scenarios will be played out. And they did not anticipate, that is the most obvious one, I don't think any one of us did, to be honest, the erosion of liberal democratic values within the West as well, in North America and in Western Europe, which means that Europe's own raison d'etre and its whole assumptions about how the world looks like become shattered. So in other words, Europe has found itself unprepared to deal with a world that does not abide by the rule book it set up itself. And it's now trying to adjust the rule book, and it's trying to experiment as it goes, because as we were saying with Mr. Garchevich before, you know, it is an evolutionary process, isn't it? It's constantly work in progress. So what they're trying to match now, and I think you mentioned it, is to reconcile the desire to remain loyal and faithful to their own normative values at the same time as they try to emancipate themselves and finally take firm stances. Turkey is the best example of them all, isn't it? Turkey is on the one hand behaving the way it does in the Eastern Mediterranean to Cyprus and to Greece over the last couple of years, raising tensions. So at the same time, Turkey is a candidate country for EU membership, and EU member states are reluctant to throw it out because of obvious interlinkages, not only economically, but also, you mentioned it, the migration crisis. So what happened in the migration crisis with Syrians in particular fleeing from Syria towards Turkey and then wanting to come to Europe? What happened? Well, in my reading, what happened was Europe externalized, it sublet its migration policy. It decided, look, we can't have a common immigration policy among us. Italy, Greece, Malta, Cyprus may be exposed, but we're not going to do much about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to externalize our policy to Turkey. And by the way, they have been trying to do similar deals with countries like Egypt and elsewhere in the MENA region. So I think that's a perfect example of this complete unpreparedness of Europe, the handling of which I think will take a lot of time and a lot of soul searching. I'm not particularly optimistic, but I think we have to give it time, hoping that Europe will start externalizing conditionalities, right? And push countries to the direction it wants.
I appreciate and exactly the way it's playing out. The biggest offender in this play is really the United States for creating the migration situation that is really unprecedented in a times of the nationalism of small countries like a European Union. Obviously, the other part that the Europeans are in a cart and a tug war between the United States and Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis NATO, and trying to expand NATO into the countries rather than trying to work a peaceful coexistence with Russia and bring it to the almost to the associate member of the European Union. We are really pressing and closing their borders with NATO membership of their border states. And so it's a dilemma to the European Union and to the peace of that area, especially in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, that we have brought this to a breaking point.
Mm-hmm.
And just to interject here, this is a great discussion. I mean, I think I couldn't agree with more with Dimitri's point as far as the European Union structure is concerned. In some way, though, I mean, the European Union suffers from the same kind of colonial arrogance that predates it. I mean, it had this expectation that everybody would line up, and even the whole premise of raising the question, the end of civilization, the debate of the early 1990s, predetermines pretty much where we are today, and sort of blindsided. I mean, to say that we're completely blindsided about what happened is sort of like, really, I don't know, it's really like a superficial kind of way of looking at it, because when we were just, sort of like triumphantly saying the West won, or, the universal spreading of democracy, so on and so forth, and didn't understand really what democracy meant. That it wasn't just a labeling and an infrastructural placement, but it had like deeper economic and social dimensions that just completely were relegated. And at the very first crisis, the European Union did not act like as a liberal agent, but rather retreated in a very nationalistic, very American libertarianism at best. Sort of like, everybody out for themselves and do whatever you can kind of a thing, which really, raises all kinds of other forces. So I think, going back to Vesco's point, yeah, maybe not an identity crisis in the way that but there is a deeper identity crisis within the so-called Western umbrella right now. And that identity crisis is really being wedged by unilateral actors who have the ability to move in and act in the way that they have in a natural space, like a China, like a Russia, like a Turkey, who acts in the way that it would as the Ottoman Turkey, or a Turkey that now feels untethered by the past, no longer the sick man of Europe kind of a thing, and can really exercise all kinds of nationalistic kind of tendencies. And I think we see it in an area that, we haven't really talked about this morning, on this issue of energy. Energy becomes like, this point of contention for a lot of these countries. And Europe does not have a uniform reaction even to that. Everybody tries to get their own kind of deal on the energy agenda as well. Whether it's like Northern Europe or Southern Europe, or the pipelines politics that we're seeing playing out in the region. Do you see, Dimitri, the energy issue being a wedge issue for the Europeans?
Petra, I do, but allow me, before I address that point, just to reinforce the point you just made, because I think it's very well made. And I think it is one important, maybe an important sort of takeaway we can have from this particular session this morning, namely the fact that for as long as the Western alliance, if you like, remains so reluctant to articulate its own vision, stand behind it, right, and actually back it up with material resources, as well as with normative proclamations, those sort of phenomena will continue. I'm completely to your point. And in fact, I want to go back 20 years ago, right? Because our lecture today was about 30 years since Maastricht. Well, let's go back to the period from 9/11 to today. What we have had was a constant erosion of the belief, domestically, I mean, in the United States and in Europe, of our own liberal democratic values, the playbook that I mentioned earlier. And that erosion, by the way, affects not only other players, unilateral actors, as you call them, who are willing to play the game, but it also affects the cohesion of our societies domestically. If you look at the record levels of polarization that exist in the United States today and in a number of European states, those are not, natural phenomena. They didn't fall from the sky. They are the articulation, they are the crystallization of chronic socioeconomic challenges that our societies have been unable to deal with. And so what happens with third actors in the world is they look at this. They look at this and they say, if that's the paradigm, if that's the template, I don't want to have this.
Yeah.
And I'm very far from being a China expert, but there is one thing I know from reading about China and its rise over the last few years, and it is this. The global financial crisis has been a watershed moment in Chinese thinking about the West. Because that moment, that complete inability of the Western states, particularly the US and Europe, to deal with the global financial crisis by protecting their citizens, as well as allowing for economic governance to continue. They saw that in China and they thought, hang on, okay, we need now to re-articulate this. Right? So they are members of the WTO and the World Bank and all the rest, but they are creating parallel organizations. And they are, as I mentioned in my lecture, they are going down the bilateral route because they know that these guys are way too weak. Yeah. And we can wedge them if we play the game right. So I wanted to make that point because I fully agree with the remark you made earlier about energy. I mean, we see it being played out at different levels. There is the division you mentioned between North and South, and that's clear. We have the strategic interest game with the obvious disagreement with regard to Nord Stream between the US and Germany, and that's it's a long-lasting saga that will continue. But we also now have, of course, because we live in this multi-layered, multi-level global governance architecture, we also have new issues which arise and which also complicate the ability of Europe to articulate one position. Let me give you an example. Renewable energy, nuclears and natural gas. The idea was, only a decade ago, if you transition to natural gas and you secure gas supplies that will go through the East Med all the way to the European market, that's great. That is going to allow us to, disentangle our dependence from Russia, diversify our resources, and so on. Perfect. Well, that's not the case anymore, because now the green agenda is saying natural gas is no good, right? So natural gas is only a stopgap intermediate source of energy before you go to the real renewables. Now, the real renewables will need mass capital investment. Who can make the mass capital investment? Germany can, maybe another couple of member states, the rest cannot. So either you are going to federalize funding for green transition on energy, and that means the Germans, the French, the Italians, and a few more will pay much more into the pot through which the Greeks and the Baltic states will be able to benefit from, or everyone will go down their own route. So in a way, energy, Petro, for me is an example of the other policy areas we mentioned. Either you are going to really put the pot together, or everyone will end up going their own way in a loose intergovernmental function that leaves everyone dissatisfied.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, I agree 100%. Then you question, like, you're seeing what's going on even in Greece and the choices that are being made by this current administration, and then you're just saying, okay, well, so it's another topic for another day, I guess. But I see Vesco has come back on, which means like Vesco is ready to contribute. So I'm reading the tea leaves here as this conversation is evolving, which I like it very much. Yeah. Yes, Vesco.
I wanted to make a comment on yes, you're right. I think that when you how you outlined energy dilemma in European Union, and that definitely has a reflection on energy projects in East Med. As you know well, just a couple of days ago, East Med pipeline was criticized by the US, which was not received well in Greece, and they presented non-paper. I will reflect on it, but the question is also the project itself was a point of controversy from the very beginning. Even the company that was picked up to run the project is one behind the financial scheme in Cyprus. So, but I would want to turn to Germany, new German government. I want to ask you, what do you think about the news? First, new German government seems, okay, it's at the early stage now, but it seems to be different when it comes to its relation with Russia, and particularly in energy sector. Nord Stream in their contract behind when the government was founded, the government was formed, and the contract which was signed, this coalition like a deal, doesn't mention Nord Stream particularly, but there is like a footnote which actually refers that the new German government will abide by European Union rules when it comes to energy. Abiding by European Union rules when it comes to energy actually means putting question mark over the Nord Stream. This is the first time that something like that comes from Berlin. So my question is, how you see trajectory, and it has definitely a lot to do with the crisis in Ukraine, because it's not just what Russia has at stake, is not just what's going on in Ukraine, but actually Russia wants to have this deal done, and doesn't want anybody to challenge Nord Stream at this very final phase.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I will keep it very short because I'm not an expert on energy and I don't want to pretend to be one. I'm more familiar with German politics, Vesco, and I can answer on this. And what I will tell you is, you're right, it's very early days, and none of us really has a definite answer as to how the coalition is going to behave on this matter, or indeed on any other. But the one thing we do know is, and that applies to Germany in the same way it applies to any other EU member state, if you have a coalition, and in particular a tripartite coalition, which is unheard of in Germany in recent years, right? There are three parties there, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals. The first priority of Chancellor Scholz, remember his party only got 26% of the vote, is to keep the coalition together. Now, the foreign minister of Germany is one of the co-leaders of the Green Party. So she's obviously wanting to set a different tone. She wants to reflect the values of the Greens in foreign policy. And in my humble opinion, she's made a very promising start because she seems to be quite active and quite ambitious in terms of setting that agenda. But my fundamental point is German foreign policy with regard to Nord Stream and Russia, in my opinion, is characterized by continuity a lot more than by change. And so I don't really expect to see any revolutionary change in terms of a unilateral cancelling, unless relations with Russia collapse completely as a result of, God forbid, a ground invasion on the part of Russia in Ukraine. In the absence of that, I think there's going to be a lot of tingle and tangle, there's going to be a lot of negotiation. And I'm sure, given how pro-European this coalition government is, I mean, all three parties are professed Europhiles, they will coordinate with Brussels, they will coordinate with the Commission, but ultimately, the decision will rest in their own hands and in the way in which their own constituents, particularly the Green voters and the Social Democratic voters, would accept a continuation of Nord Stream.
Thank you, Dimitris. I fully agree with your points about continuity when it comes to German-Russian relations. Actually, the tone is set in the 19th century. And somehow, if we see like this the period of the communist revolution as something which makes things different, since the end of the Berlin Wall, I see continuity in the relation between the two, and I don't think that a new government will change this dramatically. There will be some new tones. I agree with you, and I would like to see that in the future to come. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I think, we could be talking about this for some time, Dimitri. I personally want to thank you for again. I know, like, a lot of the sessions, you say, I mean, we haven't had this week, but sometimes, you said the customary thank yous, but this was, I think I can attest by the comments I'm getting that this was a very, very enjoyable, thorough, insightful, all the positives, and like I said, you're top notch in my book as a friend, as a colleague, and as an expert in the region. The only bad thing about you is the fact that you're a Panathinaikos fan. But other than that, I think I have great admiration for you. I even respect that. Just before Matt closes us out, I want to say that if you enjoyed this conversation, you tune in about an hour and a half at 12 noon Boston time and 1900 Athens time. We're going to continue our roundtable discussion and wrap up this great second annual Georgi Danis seminar. And I want to thank everybody who participated in this morning. And thank you, Dimitri, personally. Matt, the floor is yours to take us out.
Yes, thank you again for everyone who participated, and thank you for your great lecture. Thank you, Dr. Gisarouas, for your interesting, insightful presentation. I would also like to thank our facilitator, Dr. Bumbakis, for leading this great discussion, and thank our audience as well for being here and asking these great questions. Before ending the presentation, I would like to remind everyone that there will be a roundtable discussion at noon, and that will be hosted by Dr. Bumbakis. Thank you all again for being here today, and we especially thank you, Dr. Gisarouas, for your time and great presentation.
Matt, if you say it a few more times, you'll get it. Chai.
Yeah. Sure.
Like chai, like just think of chai latte, but even better, chai. All right. Have a nice morning, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Matt.
Dimitri, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Professor Babacar, Vesco, Matthew, thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much.